So namaste again and welcome to our satsang this morning. If you follow Arun's postings, you will see that my topic today is who is the Hindu? And I wanted to discuss this topic a little bit this morning. It's a vast topic and we can have many discussions, many sessions on this. But I think for those of us who live here outside of India, in the United States, in Europe, in the Caribbean, in Africa, it's an important question as we look to future generations here in the United States and to try to answer in some ways this question. I'm not going to tell you this morning who I think is a Hindu and who is not a Hindu, but I want to present to you or to share with you two different and in some ways contrasting answers to this question, given by two important historical figures in the Hindu tradition. And then you can, think through it for yourself and think which one is perhaps more relevant and appropriate for a modern Hindu context. So the first answer, one of the earliest answers to this question, who is a Hindu, or one of the earliest to offer a definition or an explanation of this answer was a Maharashtrian writer by the name of Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. He lived in the 19th century. He passed away in 1966. But in 1923, he published a small book called Hindutva. And Hindutva, the twa is a suffix, so it translates literally into Hinduness. And his was one of the earliest attempts to answer this question, who is a Hindu, by enunciating this doctrine of Hindutva or Hinduness. What is it that is essential to this Hindu identity? So I'll start with his attempt to answer this question. And there are at least 3 or perhaps 4, however you think of it, characteristics that Savarkar described, which were for him essential to this identity. Now keep in mind that he's writing, in the very early. This book was published in 1923, before India became independent, so he's writing in the early 20th century. But he was also post-Vivekananda. So his first answer, or the first dimension, let us say, to his answer to this question, who is a Hindu, is geographical. Right? So he preferred to use an older name for India, Hindustan. In this work, he speaks of India's Hindustan, and for him, India or Hindustan is a distinct geographical entity, bordered by the mountains and the oceans. And so, first of all, he says, a Hindu is primarily a citizen, either in himself or through his ancestors of Hindustan. This is first. A Hindu is primarily a citizen, either through himself or through his ancestors of this land of Hindustan, which we speak of today as India. So on the basis of this criteria alone, if we say a Hindu is a citizen of this land of India, we can imagine as an American who becomes a citizen of India may be entitled to be called a Hindu. But that was not enough for Sarvakar. A person who becomes a citizen of India, like an American or a British or an European, he would not be satisfied calling such a person a Hindu, although for him it does include citizenship in this land of Hindustan. So this brought him to his second criteria of Hindu identity. And he used the word jati, belongingness to what he calls the Hindu jati. It's a little bit difficult to translate, but basically what he meant, and this is important and interesting for us, he says that a Hindu, in addition to the fact of birth in India and citizenship in Hindustan, is a descendant of Hindu parents and shares with other Hindus. Again, these are controversial and questionable definitions, but I'm just describing. I'm not advocating Sarvakar's viewpoint, so I'm describing it. I'll give you a contrasting viewpoint in a moment. So he says that yes, a Hindu is a descendant of Hindu parents and shares with other Hindus what he calls a common blood, traceable to the distant, what he calls the Vedic ancestors. So he doesn't offer any proof for it. It's a more affective description, but the first is the citizenship issue, and the second is what he calls common jati or common ancestry, birth of Hindu parents. Now, if we took the first two criteria alone, citizenship in this land and birth in a Hindu family, then a Muslim citizen of India satisfies the criteria. Born in India and in the distance, having Hindu ancestors, or every convert from the Hindu tradition to living in India would satisfy his first two criteria, citizenship in India and Hindu ancestry. So he asked himself this question. He says, if I stop here with these two criteria, would I be willing to include the Muslim or the Christian community in India as Hindus? And he says no. And he then enunciates a third criteria for Hindu identity. So you've got to track him a little bit, right? Citizenship in this geographical entity, common ancestry. And third, he says what he calls Sanskriti, which is connectedness or allegiance or being tied to a common culture, which he names, as I said, Sanskriti culture, on the basis that Sanskrit is a language that expresses and preserves, in his view, all that is worthy in the history of the Hindu tradition. So it includes, shared literature, shared art, festivals, rite, rituals, and so on, all that are connected with what he calls this vast Sanskriti culture. So belonging to this Sanskriti culture. So this was the third dimension of his definition, this tie to culture or Sanskriti. And on this basis, therefore, he says that the Muslim community, they may satisfy the criteria of citizenship, they may satisfy the criteria of having ancestors, common ancestry, but they do not participate or share this connectedness to the Sanskriti culture. So on the basis of this third principle, he excludes Indian Muslims and also Indian Christians. Now, he was very much aware that there were certain communities in India certain, what we will call today, certain syncretistic communities. In particular, there were certain Muslim communities like the Bohras or the Khojas of Gujarat, who, though Muslim, fused their practice of Islam with many aspects of Sanskriti culture. So they were these are fusion type of communities, that their Islam was very distinctive from, say, what you might find in the Islam of Saudi Arabia, because they had incorporated many of the traditions of Sanskriti culture. So what do you do with them? Where do you place them? Because of their participation in Sanskriti culture. So this is where he turns now to adding what I may regard as a fourth dimension to his definition of who is a Hindu. And this is where he comes to religion. So far he hasn't said anything about religion or religious identity, right? He talked about citizenship, he talked about common blood, he talks about culture. Culture doesn't necessarily imply religion, but on the fourth dimension he comes and he speaks about religion, and here is where he talks about Hinduism, right? So he says, yes, it is true that they may participate in certain cultural features of the Sanskriti culture, but essentially they are not followers of one of the religious traditions of India. So they are not followers of one of the Vedic traditions, or they're not followers of what he calls Hindu Dharma. Now, he, interestingly, and this is an aside, he includes in his definition of who is a Hindu, he includes the Jains, he includes the Sikhs, and he includes the South Asian Buddhists, not the East Asian Buddhists, not the Buddhists of Japan and Korea, but the South Asian Buddhist community as Hindus, because they follow what he regards as one of the traditions that originated on the soil of India. So even though communities like the Khojas and the Bohras incorporated many aspects of Ramayana tradition or Mahabharata tradition and so on as part of their Islamic practice of certain forms of culture and music, he doesn't name them as Hindus, because he says by religion, now he introduces religion. By religion, they don't follow one of the traditions that originated in India. And because of which, this is going to be important, because of which he says, in his definition of the religious dimension, he says that a Hindu is really a person who regards India, in his word, he calls it as Punya Bhumi, as a holy land. Punya Bhumi. Not only is it for him or her motherland, but it's also a sacred land. Punya Bhumi. And these traditions don't regard, what he says, their holy lands are outside of India. They don't regard India as a Punya Bhumi. So, for him, being a Hindu does have a religious dimension, right? As a follower of one of the traditions originating in India, whether this is Jainism, Sikhism, South Asian Buddhism, or the Vedic tradition. But that's only one dimension in his understanding of Hindu identity. Secondly, you must also share a common culture. You must have Hindu ancestors, so the jati, and to citizenship of India. Interesting, I mentioned as an aside that some had raised with him the question, in Swami Vivekananda, who I'll come to in a moment, had a very famous disciple. was an American woman who became his disciple, went back to India, lived in India and founded schools and service type organizations. Her name was Nivedita. Sister Nivedita was one of the foremost disciples of Vivekananda. So he was asked, well, would you regard her as a Hindu? It is true that she doesn't satisfy, at least 3 of your criteria, but in terms of the criteria of religion, wouldn't you regard her as a... And he struggled a lot with that, actually. And he says, well, okay, eventually I'll make an exception for Nivedita, but only for her. So in essence, religion was only one of these multiple dimensions, in his view, for who is a Hindu. And you cannot define, in Sarvakar's view, it was not enough to call someone a Hindu. You required all of the components to fall in place. Common ancestry, common culture, citizenship in India. Clearly he didn't think, he was going back to some very ancient notions, as you know, well, not quite ancient. If you've read the life story of Mahatma Gandhi, when he wanted to go to India to study law, his community objected. Said, no, you can't go outside, you can't cross the waters, because once you cross these waters, you're no longer able to be a Hindu. The Kala Pani, the black waters, if you cross, So there was this notion, that being a Hindu means to be a citizen of India, to reside only in India. Once you opted out of India, So he was expelled. He was actually expelled from his community in Gujarat. And afterwards he had to be formally accepted back into his community. So we see at least some traces of that kind of thinking in Sarvakar's view. Now, having given you this outline of Sarvakar's, I want to give you a contrasting definition. And I want to turn to the person that I mentioned already, Swami Vivekananda. How did he think about this question? Who is a Hindu? Hindu identity. How do we compare Vivekananda with Sarvakar? As you know, I'm sure you're familiar with some of the details of Vivekananda's life, but most important, was his journey to the West in 1893 when he came to speak in Chicago at the Parliament of World Religions. In 1893 he spoke there. 1895 he founded the Vedanta Society in New York, and he founded various Vedanta societies here in the United States, out in the West and the East Coast, even St. Louis in Missouri for the study of the Vedanta. He founded the Ramakrishna Mission in India. Now, when we look at the way in which, in 1893, when he spoke at the Parliament and subsequently, how was he using these terms, Hindu and Hinduism? It is very clear that for Vivekananda, the word Hindu meant primarily, and I would say maybe only, a religious identity. He didn't associate it with having Hindu ancestry or life, citizenship in India, or even necessarily, a particular culture. It denoted for him a religious identity, and he doesn't distinguish between Hindu and Hinduism in a way that Sarvakar was doing. So for Sarvakar, the ism, Hinduism, the ism of Hindu was only one part of it, the religious part of it, but you had Hindu meant all these other things. But for Vivekananda, it meant solely and primarily a commitment to a certain religious way of being, which was, and this explains why he came to the West. It was a commitment to a religious way of being, which was accessible and open to any human being. To any human being. So, for Vivekananda, a Hindu first and foremost is a person who subscribes to one of the religious traditions of Hinduism. He himself was, as you know, he was committed to the Vedanta tradition. Right? And not only Vedanta, he was committed to the Advaita Vedanta tradition of Shankara, the non-dual tradition. This was his own personal commitment. But he does not limit the word Hindu only to the Vedanta or the Advaita tradition. He includes the Vaishnavas as Hindus, the Shaivas as Hindus, the Shaktas as Hindus, the Vishishta Advaitins as Hindus, the Dvaitins as Hindus, because for him it was primarily about a certain worldview, a commitment to a certain practice that any human being can adopt and incorporate. So he says, if a Hindu is not spiritual, I don't call him a Hindu. He can satisfy every other thing, every other criteria, but if he is not committed to this spirituality, then I don't regard him or her as. And throughout his lectures at the Parliament, he consistently uses the word Hindu to describe a certain religious commitment. You just think about it, he would not have made the journey to the United States if he had subscribed to Sarvakar's definition. Why would he come here? Because Americans can't be Hindus. If you conclude, if you're an American, if you're a citizen of the United States, you have a culture that is different from the culture of Hindu. You don't have Hindu parents, then you cannot become a Hindu. You cannot adopt the tradition of one of the Hindu traditions. So he would not have even made that journey if he had subscribed to that kind of view of the Hindu tradition. And in various, in various lectures that he gave both in the United States and in India, he tried to describe what he considered to be the essential elements of that religious worldview. As I said, he had a very broad and expansive view. He had his own particular commitment, but he didn't limit the understanding of who is a Hindu to his religious commitment. He was not a Vaishnava, but he saw Vaishnavas as Hindus. He was not a Vishishta Advaitin, but he saw them as one of the many traditions, the religious traditions, so he embraced it. But when he spoke about, this religious worldview, he spoke about the Vedas, the authority of the Vedas or the significance of Vedas. He spoke about, life having he spoke about punarjanma and karma, the cyclical understanding of life, that the opposite of life is not death but rebirth. He spoke about karma, or human responsibility for our actions individually and collectively. He spoke about the Atman, the immortality, the deathless nature of the human self. So, also it's important to note that he would not say, that everybody is a Hindu. He didn't go there. To be a Hindu meant to hold on to a particular worldview, and these are some of the elements. It will be hard to think of someone who belongs to one of the Hindu traditions and who didn't affirm a belief in rebirth or the teaching on karma. So he had certain definite, for him, certain definite elements of a worldview that would mark or made the Hindu a unique theological position. But this is what it was for him. So for him, being a Hindu was embracing an identity that was not limited by nationality. For him, being Hindu and being Indian were not the same. Being Hindu and being Indian were not the same things. An American may not be an Indian, which means, born in or having citizenship in India, but could be a Hindu, because this was for him a religious commitment. So he separated nationality and religion, unlike Savarkar, who fused the two. And in a similar way, I would say, Vivekananda also did not identify religion solely with culture. The Hindu tradition was a religious worldview that could exist in a variety of cultural settings and locations. It was not tied inseparably to a particular culture. Of course, he loved his culture, right? As a person born in India, he loved his culture and celebrated it, but didn't tie the spirituality or the religion of Hinduism solely to culture. So you could be a Viking supporter and also be a Hindu. Right? Or I could support the West Indian cricket team and also be a Hindu. Right? When West Indies was playing cricket, I could be passionate about the West Indies winning and not India, but I can still be a Hindu. Just giving you example. Now, as you know, those of you who have read about Vivekananda, he loved his country. He was a very passionate nationalist also. He was a passionate nationalist. And you read his writings, you will see that for him, India was Punya Bhumi. It was. Everything he said, he spoke very passionately about India as a sacred land for him. And he feels blessed, that he was born in India and had his guru, and he was able to draw deeply from these traditions of India. But he didn't make it a requirement for being a Hindu. So you can be, if you're born in the United States, this can be your Punya Bhumi. This can be your sacred land for your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren. This is where their roots are. Right? But they can be Hindu once they adopt the theology, or one of the theological traditions of. So he had great veneration for India as a land of spirituality, as a place for his tradition, but he doesn't use the term in the same way as a fundamental requirement of Hindu identity. He doesn't use it to exclude others. The last point I'll make about contrasting Vivekananda and Savarkar is that he doesn't also try to include Sikhs or Jains or Buddhists in the category of Hindus. He said, they've got their distinctive traditions, we respect that. He doesn't use the label to include them in the category of the Hindu tradition, while at the same time recognizing the close ties and affinity that these traditions had with the Hindu tradition, but he respected their distinctive natures. So, what do we make of these two very contrasting definitions of what it means to be Hindu? And I think that in some regards, they still exist, these two ways of thinking about the Hindu tradition, and they still are in tension. You see it appearing in various debates and in various contexts. So let me give you just an example. If I go to perform puja in a temple, so you might want to ask me, I'm giving you some example to show you where this tension might appear in contemporary practice. And it is quite likely that if I go to perform puja, the Hindu priest would ask me, what is your gotra? Right? he would ask me, what is your gotra? My son, my daughter, they may not know what is their gotra. But gotra is exactly what one of the characteristics that Sarvakar was pointing out. A common family line, right? Common family ancestry. So if you say, well, if a priest says to a young Hindu boy or girl who says, I don't know what, like there was a famous example in one of the Upanishads, in Chandogya Upanishad. There's a very, very fascinating, powerful story. This young boy, Satyakama, he wanted to study the Vedas. And so he knew that if he went to the priest who would teach him the Vedas, the priest would ask him first, what is your gotra? What is the family lineage? What is the family lineage? And the gotra in traditional Orthodox Hindu tradition actually came from the father. It was a patrilineal descent. So he went to his mother because he didn't know who his father was. This was a single, interestingly, in the Veda, this was a single mother. So he went to his mother and he said, I want to become a student of the Veda. I have to go to this priest. Please tell me, what is my gotra? And the mom understood immediately the significance of this question. So she was very honest with him. And she says, look, Satyakama, I do not know. I was a struggling woman. I worked in many homes. Basically, she's talking about being an abused woman also. And I gave birth to you. I don't know who your father is, and therefore I cannot tell you what is your gotra, what is your lineage. If you want, go to the priest and tell him exactly what I said to you. Tell him what I said. That you don't know who your father is. So this boy, he went to the priest, and as he expected, the first question was, what is your lineage? Who is your father? One thing I missed out. Her name was Jabala. She says, go and tell him that you are Satyakama Jabala. Use my name. So he goes to the priest, and the first question he asks him, he expected, who's your dad? Who's your father? What is your gotra? And he said exactly what she told him. My mom told me that she doesn't know. She worked in various homes as a maid servant. All I know is that her name is Jabala, my name is Satyakama, and I am Satyakama Jabala. Fortunately, in this Upanishad, the teacher said, I have you as a student because you spoke the truth. You told the truth. And therefore the truth qualifies you to study the Shastra, not the fact of your lineage or birth, but your truthfulness. And so if he would have excluded, if he stuck to that definition, Satyakama would have no opportunity to be a Vedic student. And so if we say today, that you can only do Hindu rituals, or you can only participate in puja if you have a gotra, then we would be excluding, We have to decide today that whether the Hindu tradition is an ethnic tradition or it is a human tradition. For Vivekananda, it was a human tradition, accessible and open to any interested or inquiring human being. For Sarvakar, it was an ethnic tradition, limited, by birth by culture, and in his case, by citizenship in the land of in India. I think that's where the tension today, is still there with us. If you want to know what my personal view is, I have outlined two particular. My own perspective, always as a teacher of the Hindu tradition, as a public teacher, as a college teacher of the Hindu tradition, is that this tradition is a human tradition. It is a universal human tradition that offers a worldview for any interested human being, and that we must be a hospitable tradition. We say, Atiti Devo Bhava, that the stranger is divine. And part of what that means is also welcoming the interested stranger into our tradition, provided that the interest is deep and sincere, and it's true. We have to practice. That's also what it means to be a hospitable tradition, an inclusive tradition, and not. Sarvakar was thinking, when you look at his work, Hindutva, and his definition, he was thinking much more, how can I exclude it? How can I develop a criteria? It was more an attempt to develop an exclusive criteria. Clearly with Vivekananda, you get an inclusive criteria about what it means to be Hindu. And I think personally that the inclusive way of thinking is our future. That the future of the Hindu tradition is being an inclusive, hospitable tradition. We are not, and we have not been a missionary tradition in the traditional sense. But that doesn't mean that we cannot be hospitable and welcoming tradition for people of all nationalities, of all cultures, of all family backgrounds. I think that is what it means essentially to be a Hindu. I think we would end up limiting the tradition if we define the Hindu by citizenship, by lineage, or narrowly by culture. We have also to think about what are the essential and non-essential aspects of our tradition. What will endure across time and what will keep on. What will be the changing dimensions of tradition as well. I had a friend, I'll tell you a little story which is true. Because we were talking about, he came to me one day and he said, there was this a non-Hindu person who wanted to become a Hindu, and who asked him, how do I become a Hindu? And this was a very person I regarded as a learned person. So I said, what did you say to him? What answer did you give him? And he very proudly, and he thought very smartly, and he thought that I would be very happy with his answer. He said, I told him, drop dead. And what he meant was that you cannot become a Hindu, you have to be born a Hindu. So drop dead, reborn, and try again. Basically. So I was quite taken back by his answer, But I realized that there was a viewpoint there that that you cannot become a Hindu unless, again, he's now following Sarvakar's definition, birth in a Hindu family. So he's following a more constricted version of it, thinking that he had given me a very brilliant answer in 2 words to this question. So please don't tell anyone who wants to become a Hindu. Let's manifest the welcoming openness of Swami Vivekananda, who came to share what he came to share with others what he felt was most precious to him, which was his spiritual tradition. And he wanted to not to force people to accept it, but simply to offer it to those who he felt were yearning for the wisdom of India and the wisdom of the Hindu.
Namaha